If The Hills Have Eyes got a cult following for one thing, it's the wild concept of crazy cannibals living in the vast empty wasteland of the Nevada desert, stalking, murdering and eating innocent tourists. And yes, while that is basically the premise, The Hills Have Eyes sought to be more than just a bizarre twist on the splatter genre that would in part kickstart those niche pulp inbred cannibal killer flicks that sparsely pop up randomly over the years. Sure, the cannibal boom of the 70s and 80s was more of an Italian thing that returned to the whole primitive tribal mentality to challenge contemporary assumptions of what civilized society really was in a time of political and social unrest. Yet, while The Hills Have Eyes doesn't hold a severed arm to many of those films, mostly because it avoided the video nasty tag by reducing its obscenity as much as possible, making for just a pretty average horror movie in comparison to what the Europeans were getting up to, it has its place in Western cinema as another casual commentary on American culture that gravitated towards the shocking on-screen violence that eventually desensitized and became popular amongst the general audiences. So let's talk about why The Hills Have Eyes. For context, I'll be jumping between Wes Craven's 1977 original and the 2006 remake by new French extremity filmmaker Alexandre Aja because both films are structurally similar to each other bar several tonal and thematic differences I'll address throughout the video. But to get the ball rolling, the original concept of The Hills Have Eyes treaded in the same territory as other exploitation films at the time. It was Wes Craven's third directorial effort, with his debut exploitation thriller The Last House on the Left being his calling card for producers who wanted stories that capitalized on the heavily provocative topic of the worst of humanity. The thing was, however, Craven wanted to drift away from such dire subject matter, yet with enough persuasion he decided to take a more exaggerated approach on the whole premise of civilized people falling into savagery when faced with unrelenting danger, by adding humour and eccentricity without compromising on the social criticism that still has relevance today. In his own words, Craven was pretty open about wanting to avoid uncomfortable human depravity, except The Hills Have Eyes was ultimately just an extension to the same idea behind The Last House on the Left, where it could have theoretically have been its own anthology if Hollywood producers weren't such pussies when it came to controversy. Would you believe it? Whereas The Last House on the Left played on the premise of letting stranger danger into the safe confines of your home and showing us how far some might be willing to go to protect their loved ones, The Hills Have Eyes strips its protagonists of the familiar, harmonious middle-class household and deprives them of their taken-for-granted luxuries, to which they themselves become the unexpected intruders to a family who see the wilderness as their home. Essentially, the story is about a feud between two culturally different families where morality and civilization have no place in survival, because when it comes purely down to our own safety, we are all equally capable of doing terrible things to each other. Sure, it doesn't sound like a new thematic angle because obviously Last House on the Left had already did it, but for the 70s it was still a new emerging trend in horror cinema. It challenged moral assumptions about good and bad characters. Until then, most stories were largely binary about their heroes and villains, and while The Hills Have Eyes does establish these archetypes initially, it concludes with a pretty clear message that morality and civilized culture is a product of fabrication when we harrowingly witness our joyful, passive, caring hero Doug horrifically batter the ever-loving shit out of the main villain, while the villain's sibling stares traumatized and emotionally broken. While researching for the idea in the New York Public Library, Craven's inspiration for the story came from the legend of Sawney Bean, the leader of a 16th century Scottish clan made up of Bean's children sustained through incest, who were said to have brutally murdered and cannibalized over 1,000 people. While the authenticity of the story is questionable given the inconsistencies of various sources, Craven wasn't so much interested in the cannibal incest inbred family clan, but rather their treatment after being arrested, where they were hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a method of torturous execution which Craven saw as extremely twisted and barbaric for such a supposedly civilized society who went after the clan for being, well, just as barbaric. As such, the way Craven described the film, it was about showing a symbolic relationship between class cultures and the conflict between those catered to by society for reinforcing traditions and ideals, and those marginalised, neglected and forgotten to waste away for not conforming to social order. Now, this is where things get heated. I'm going to tread pretty carefully around this because politics and the internet have a temperamental relationship, shall we say. Generally speaking, a large part of the film's first act is establishing the leader to our protagonist, Big Bob, an aggressively patriotic, gun-loving, xenophobic, sexist, racist, and everything in between. The film projects a certain ignorance and arrogance around those who reinforce this crippling ideology in the vein of staying high on the food chain when, in reality, that blindness to the wilderness around them leaves them exposed to becoming the inferior creature and prey to this literal food chain. It's not so much a jab at any political stance per se. The film is trying to be as broad and neutral as possible to a certain degree. It's instead trying to highlight a blatant hypocrisy about our society, where it's okay to be barbaric and cruel as long as you're part of a civilized system of order that permits being barbaric and cruel. Big Bob then justifies a certain savagery behind his beliefs because it's what their nation is kinda built on: protection and survival. Yet, these same beliefs are somehow null and void to anyone outside normal social circles. In other words, the cannibals, despite following the same order as Big Bob, are the deviant nonconformists and thus have no right to uphold the same values. Because that's human nature for you. The 2006 remake does take a more satirical route with this, but ironically it comes off as pretty hypocritical itself actually. On the one hand, I agree with the sentiment that the remake is a little too preachy about its politics by having big conservative Bob persistently belittle Doug for being a weak pacifist liberal, yet then it decides to conclude with Doug embracing Bob's gun-toting patriotism where he goes off on a vengeful rampage. I mean, it doesn't hurt the film from an emotional angle, but given how touchy politics is these days, it does have a pretty inconsistent statement about society's ideological divide. I suppose, on the other hand, Doug's inability to protect his family from being murdered because he refuses to engage on a violent level neutralizes whatever debate the film is trying to have with itself, but the original doesn't force any specific perspective onto the audience, although it's probably already too late to say calm your tits to anyone who feels a need to express their vitriol in the comments below. That said, Ajay himself expressed that he approached the remake as a European outsider, commentating on what he perceived as an American divide based on Craven's original output. It's not trying to be cynically offensive, even if it probably is just as ignorant, but instead magnify a perspective that the outside world might have of America. The last point I'll make about the remake is the radioactive mutants angle it takes. In the original, it's really just established that the gas stop worker was the leader's father who abandoned his son to die in the hills because of his violent tendencies, but survived and cultivated a family defined by violence and savagery. In the remake, they basically take on the idea that the military were testing nukes and shit and the family were mutated by radiation, suggesting that they are a direct result of the military's engagement in war and power retention, perpetuating the same cycle of violence and savagery. I mean, it is an interesting take, but like with its confusing approach to politics, it's muddled and sometimes patronizing in execution. From a horror standpoint, the use of daylight and wide, desolate cinematography conveys a palpable sense of paranoia and exposure. The family constantly look like lit-up easy targets, and the continued ignorance of Big Bob only leads them down into further danger by splitting them apart both figuratively and literally. The cannibals are shown to be incredibly cunning and strategic in their attacks, unlike the remake that goes mostly for the unreasonable, psychopathic approach. There is a constant motif surrounding father figures. Big Bob and his son Bobby, named after him, is a clear symbolic statement about trying to pass on your ideologies to another generation, where Bobby is kind of shown to question aspects of it when Doug takes over as another role model, again reinforcing two ideologies at conflict with each other, showing both their goods and their bads. In either film, I don't think it really goes anywhere, but if there's one thing the film does to keep you engaged in the drama, is how natural their personal conflicts and relationships are. In the remake, it's obvious that Bob and Doug have extreme differences that manifest into whatever conclusion it decides to come to, whereas in the original, there's a point to be made about Bob being overly protective and cautious about being behind enemy lines. And he's actually right, his worries are genuine and justified, and when it comes to Doug, he kinda just shrugs it off like a laid-back hippie, putting his guard down, which ultimately becomes the very thing that gets his wife and mother-in-law killed. I'm not convinced The Hills Have Eyes always hits the mark with its point. That is, if it even has a point. It's obviously a political criticism given it released not long after the US conceded in the Vietnam War, but with my own interpretation of the remake in mind, it seems to take this point, force in some sort of relevancy, and then completely backtrack into excessive violence, which from an entertainment point of view isn't worth complaining about because it is admittedly pretty gratifying. Now, some folks will mention the sequels, they're all god-awful, and despite directing the second film, Craven admitted that it was just a cash grab because he needed the money, so when you take this into account, it kinda continues the cycle of hypocrisy we all face. For as much as we drone on about our values, morals, and integrity, when the going gets tough and we succumb to the pressures of the world, we simply switch to the one value that means the most to us. We do what we need to survive.